So, I know what a lot of people are going to say. This is a conspiracy theory. All the media is biased against Corbyn and Labour. It seems unlikely.
Well, people often use the term a conspiracy theory to dismiss views they don't like. But it's not a conspiracy theory to say that General Motors wants to maximize their profit. And it's not a conspiracy theory to think that owners of the mainstream media want to maximize their profits. Now, here's a really important book by Noam Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent that made this point 30 years ago. Also, listen to this short exchange between Chomsky and Andrew Marr from the BBC on this topic a long time back.
These are big business, big corporations selling privileged audiences to other corporations. Now the question is, what picture of the world would a rational person expect to come out of this structure? And then we draw some conclusions about what you'd expect, and then we check, and yes, that's the picture of the world that comes out.
And is this anything more than the idea that basically the press is relatively right-wing, with some exceptions, because it's owned by big business, which is a truism, is well known?
Well, I would call the press relatively liberal. Here I agree with the right-wing critics. So especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are called, without a trace of irony, the New York Times is called the establishment left in, say, major foreign policy journals. And that's correct, but what's not recognized is that the role of the liberal intellectual establishment is to set very sharp bounds on how far you can go, this far and no further.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that
you're
journalists
self-censoring? I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
So, the key idea here is that the media bias is not a conspiracy. It is what you would predict from a system in which a few corporations own most of the media. And it's not that journalists are conspiring amongst themselves to make their bosses happy. It is a product of hiring people who share the views of the corporations. If you have similar views to Chomsky, you will not get far in the BBC or The Guardian, let alone The Times, The Telegraph and Sky News. You select the people who are good for business.
Yep, that is Chomsky's characterization of the media. And Chomsky in the full interview shows how the evidence supports this theory across a whole range of historical events, from the Vietnam War to the NAFTA free trade deal in North America.
So, what would this theory predict in the case of media coverage of Corbyn? And is there any evidence for it?
Well, think about it. We have a Conservative Party who wants to keep the system pretty much the same. I mean, they've been in power for the last decade. We have a Liberal Democratic Party that was recently in coalition with the Conservatives who want to move things a bit to the left, but not too far. And then we have the Labour Party that wants to make really radical changes to the system, and that involves increasing the taxes on both corporations and on the wealthy. So, which party do you think the mainstream media might oppose?
Probably Labour.
Okay, that's exactly right. So that's the prediction. Let's look into some of the evidence. And first, let's again consider the case of anti-Semitism, because I think it's the most striking form of evidence in support of Chomsky's theory. It's been quite striking how much attention has been given to anti-Semitism in the Labour Party during the general election. And that's been amplified to another level based on the recent comments of the chief rabbi of the Orthodox synagogue, who represents about 40,000 out of a total of 300,000 British Jews. And as I've shown before, there's more anti-Semitism in the right compared to the left. Here's Laura Kuenssberg claiming it's more of a problem in the Labour Party. This level of bias is a bit hard to understand until you watch this clip.
I think you have to understand about Boris Johnson is he really wants to be loved. And actually underneath it all, he's quite shy. But we all know someone like that, right? We all know someone who plays the clown. Because they don't want to be themselves. Given how you were the most prominent face in the Brexit campaign, do you feel responsible for the...
Yeah, you bet. You bet. Put it this way, I certainly think that the role I played in the campaign means that I have a complete duty to try to argue for what I believe in.
Someone said to me, you're like a child who keeps asking for a pony.
I never had a pony.
It sort of looked like it had been filmed by her husband.
Yeah.
With regards to the accusation of anti-Semitism from the chief rabbi, what Laura, the BBC, and the media in general missed is that the chief rabbi is not a neutral party in politics. He is a conservative, both in the Jewish community and also in the UK in Israeli politics. What Laura and the BBC and the rest of the media have largely or completely ignored is that other Jewish leaders support Corbyn and reject the claim that Corbyn is anti-Semitic. What everyone seems to have missed is that the rabbi who wrote the pro-Corbyn letter has been threatened. It's just ignored. This is not balanced reporting. This quote from Chomsky is perfect. But let's look at other cases too.
So, do you remember the bowing gate with Corbyn a few years ago? Corbyn had just become leader of the Labour Party and he didn't show enough respect on Remembrance Day.
Yeah, but the controversy was absurd. I mean, check out the following clip.
And when one should bow and how far one should bow, Sonny. I know you have strong opinions on this subject.
I know. I can't say this because apparently it's quite rude, but if you are on social media, there's a very handy explainer of how much you should and should not bow, and every inch of it means something. So I think he falls between between unacceptable versus outright dangerous.
He's not quite a communist then.
Oh, you may well be. But
And do you remember the train gate? Didn't Corbyn sit on the floor of a Virgin train and pretend there were no available seats?
Yeah, again, another absurd controversy. Check out this clip.
Well, we've called a press conference on the NHS, and I really hoped that you'd be able to find a question on the NHS. But if you can't, we'll take another one.
Okay, good stuff. Just because I think lots of people watching what's happened the last 24 hours are not able to kind of tee it all together, to kind of square the circle in a sense, that you are on the train and the CCTV images show you walking by empty reserved and unreserved seats. So what at 11:10, that was before you made that film saying the train was full. Why did you not sit in one of those seats?
Because they were reserved seats.
So, on Remembrance Day this year, during the election campaign, the BBC mixed up their tapes and played a recording from a few years back. This is interesting because Johnson looked dishevelled, confused, and put the wreath on backwards.
Yeah, and people caught this manipulation, and the BBC was forced to apologise, saying it was an honest error.
In the first BBC debate between Johnson and Corbyn, Johnson was asked about trust and there was laughing in the audience. But the BBC edited this out in a news clip. Check this out.
How important is it for someone in your position of power to always tell the truth?
I think it's absolutely vital. And I think it's absolutely vital.
Also, a few years back, Laura Kuenssberg edited a video to make it look like Corbyn would not support, quote, shoot to kill under any circumstances. Turns out it was false, and that the BBC criticized Laura for doctoring the video. But this false account is now being used against Corbyn in relation to the terrible terrorist attack that just happened in London the other day.
The media have done their best to minimise the criticisms that the Conservatives have received regarding the NHS. Happy to report staged events that make Johnson look good and largely ignore the protests. When Labour reported on documents that suggest the NHS is on the table, journalists were still more interested in the topic of anti-Semitism, and that very day BBC reported a cute story of Johnson visiting hospitals.
The reason for putting a jam on the jam is adhesive. Yeah. Right. You're doing it the Cornish way. I'm doing it the Cornish way.
As Angela Rayner said, this was a non-story, avoiding a real one. The launch of the Conservative Manifesto was a disaster under Theresa May because they had to backtrack on something called the dementia tax. This time, the Conservatives launched their manifesto in a town called Telford. And again, they messed up big time. But I've heard almost nothing about that in the mainstream media.
Well, thank you, Nick. And I'm looking at Matt Hancock here because I know that that we have kept the A&E open, and we will ensure that it is open, and I will absolutely insist on that. And I know that Matt will be very happy to give you more details about that afterwards. But we will certainly make sure the A&E in Telford is kept open.
Just the other day, extremely offensive comments by Johnson were unearthed, mentioned in Daily Mirror and The Guardian, but as far as I can tell, not reported in The Telegraph, Times, BBC, or Koonsberg and her tweets.
Well, right, let me just share. These are comments that go back to the mid-90s. They're featured in today's Daily Mirror. I have to read them. On working class men, Mr. Johnson, you said they're likely to be drunk, criminal, aimless, feckless and hopeless, and perhaps claiming to suffer from low self-esteem brought on by unemployment. On single mothers, they're uppity, which is a word with its own issues, and irresponsible. And on their children, they're ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate. You've dismissed quite a chunk of the electorate there, Prime Minister, haven't you?
So these are nice examples, but I'm sure someone else could come up with similar examples on the other side.
Well, I defy anybody to find any comments by Corbyn that are remotely as offensive as those by Johnson. But more importantly, there are studies that show that what we're saying reflects a systematic bias in the media. It's not cherry-picked examples we've been highlighting here.